Okay, this is the 2015 FRQ number 1. And the situation they give us is assume the United States economy is operating below full employment, and then we need to draw the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So we'll start off with that. For letter A, we need to make sure we label the graph properly. So we'll put the price level over here, GDP real. And then the first thing I like to do is just draw the short run aggregate supply, draw the aggregate demand, and then say, okay, well, where does the long run go? Because we're below full employment, we're in a recessionary gap. So I would draw the long run aggregate supply over here. And this is where we currently are. We would say this is price level 1. And this is our output 1. And the full employment output would be at the long run aggregate supply. So we've taken care of letter A. Then letter B says, assume the Federal Reserve targets a new Fed funds rate to reach full employment. So in order to do that, since we're in a recessionary gap, we would need to strengthen the economy, have it go faster, and have the GDP real increase. And so the Fed funds rate that would do that would be a lower Fed funds rate. Lower interest rates will increase consumption and investment spending. So that's done. We don't need to explain or anything. And letter C, given the Federal Reserve action identified in Part B, draw clearly the graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. Okay, so we're just going to draw the money market graph here. The money supply graph. And so we'll have nominal interest rates and quantity of money. And then we'll have a vertical money supply to begin and a downward sloping money demand curve. The action was buying bonds to lead to a lower interest rate. So we'll show that shift. Our original rate 1 here and our rate 2 showing it lower. And it's important to show those arrows when you're drawing the graphs, but you won't have to draw them on the 2020 AP test. So that is all set. And then letter D talks about the multiplier. So if fiscal policy is the action taken rather than monetary policy, assume that the MPC is 0.8 and the value of the recessionary gap is 300 billion. So immediately when I see that, I know, okay, I'm going to have to do something with this MPC. I know my MPS then is 0.2, and my multiplier then is going to be 1 over the MPS, which is 1 over 1/5, which equals 5. So I know my multiplier is 5 in this economy. The recessionary gap is 300 billion. So in order to close that gap, I go 300 divided by 5 is 60 billion. So $60 billion of fiscal policy stimulus with the multiplier of 5 would get us to that 300 billion and close that gap. So reading question 1, if the government changes its spending without changing taxes to eliminate the recessionary gap, calculate the minimum required change in government spending. That's the 60 billion. And then letter D, part 2, if the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum required change in government spending? All right, there's a mouthful there. So what you need to understand is that the tax multiplier is 1 less than the regular multiplier. So they would have to do a greater change. And that's what the explanation is as well, is that it's a greater change because the tax multiplier is 1 less than the spending multiplier. Part of the increase in income will be saved rather than spent. And that's why it would need to be a greater stimulus with taxes. And then letter E, assume the government lowers tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same? So if the government lowers tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap, what's going to happen to aggregate demand? Well, aggregate demand, if we go back to our original graph here, aggregate demand will end up shifting to the right. And that shift to the right, how we would answer that would be aggregate demand would increase. So for E1, we would say that it's going to increase. And the explanation is because there'll be an increase in consumption and or investment spending with the stimulus that happens. And then the second part of part E, we also need to explain what's happening to long-run aggregate supply. And it kind of depends on how you want to word this. There's a couple different answers that they did accept this year as okay, but you could just say that there be no change in long-run aggregate supply because we're just getting back to where we originally were. You could technically say that there might be an increase if there was increased investment spending, which resulted in greater physical capital and greater potential real GDP in the future. But I think it's simplest just here to say there'd be no change as you just see the increase in consumption or investment spending and no real change in inputs.